What if the story we were taught about America's beginnings is not about liberty at all, but about something very different, something far more unsettling? We are raised with the image of brave pilgrims boarding the Mayflower, crossing a stormy sea, and stepping onto a new shore in search of religious freedom. We imagine families gathering at the first Thanksgiving table, sharing food and peace with native neighbors. We picture the Puritans proclaiming a city on a hill, a shining light of democracy for the world. But behind this image lies a story of fear, of exclusion, of harsh laws and punishment, of wars fought not only against the people already living on this continent, but against dissenters within their own ranks. So here is the question. Did the Pilgrims and Puritans truly come to America for freedom? Or did they come to build something entirely different, something far narrower and more rigid, a society where freedom was reserved only for themselves and denied to almost everyone else? The traditional story told in classrooms, children's books, and holiday speeches is simple and inspiring. It begins with the Mayflower, carrying a group of humble yet brave men, women, and children fleeing persecution in England. They endure hunger, storms, and fear, and after a long voyage, they reach the rocky coast of New England. Their first winter is devastating. Half die of starvation and disease. Yet through courage, faith, and cooperation with Native Americans, they survive. When autumn comes, they host a great feast of Thanksgiving. Native and European sit side by side, sharing food and friendship. This meal becomes the seed of an enduring American tradition. A decade later, more settlers arrive, the Puritans, who envision their settlement as a city upon a hill, a shining example of freedom and democracy for the whole world to follow. Politicians and school teachers repeat this version endlessly. Thanksgiving parades celebrate it, paintings immortalize it, presidents invoke it in speeches. It is not only history, it is myth, a founding legend meant to inspire. But like most legends, it hides as much as it reveals. Notice what this story does not include. It does not include the internal conflicts among the Pilgrims themselves, nor the strict and unforgiving laws they imposed on their own community. It does not mention that their freedom was for themselves only, and that those who disagreed were punished, exiled, or even executed. It does not include the wars they fought against native peoples, wars that left villages burned, survivors enslaved, and alliances shattered. It does not tell us that the Puritans, whose words about a city on a hill are quoted as a call to liberty, were actually warning their followers of God's punishment should they fail to maintain strict obedience. And it certainly does not mention that their colonies often looked far more like rigid theocracies than free democracies. The myth was shaped later, especially in the 19th century, when Americans torn apart by civil war and division needed a story to hold them together. The Pilgrims became symbols of unity, humility, and faith. Their actual history was scrubbed, polished, and reimagined until it resembled something closer to a sermon than a record. To peel away this myth is not to tear down America, but to see it more clearly. And the reality we uncover is far more human, far more conflicted, and far more consequential than the simple story we were taught. The Pilgrims we celebrate every Thanksgiving were not ordinary settlers seeking adventure or opportunity. They were separatists, a radical wing of English Protestantism. In early 17th century England, the official church, the Church of England, was required by law. Attendance at services was compulsory. Refusal to conform was treated as rebellion, not only against the church, but against the king himself. The separatists believed that the Church of England was beyond saving, too corrupt and too tainted by its Catholic past. They insisted that true Christians must break away entirely. For this defiance, they were fined, harassed, and sometimes jailed. William Bradford, who would later become the longtime governor of Plymouth Colony, recalled in his writings that they lived under a yoke of anti-Christian bondage. To escape persecution, they fled first to the Netherlands. In the city of Leiden, they found a measure of safety. The Dutch were far more tolerant, and here Protestants of many stripes lived side by side with Catholics and Jews. But life in Leiden was difficult. Most of the separatists were poor. They worked hard, often in menial trades, and lived far from the comforts of their English homeland. Worse, their children were absorbing Dutch language and culture. Bradford wrote of his fear that their offspring might become degenerate and corrupt their posterity. In other words, freedom in Holland came at the price of cultural identity. They worried that their community would dissolve within a generation. This fear drove them to consider a new path, to cross the Atlantic and build a society entirely their own, isolated from both English persecution and Dutch influence. When they boarded the Mayflower in 1620, they did not see themselves as pioneers of universal liberty. They saw themselves as exiles carrying a fragile covenant with God. On board, they drafted the Mayflower Compact. Modern textbooks celebrate it as a step toward democracy, but what did it actually say? It pledged the signers to create just and equal laws, but bound every member to obey them, regardless of personal will. It was less a declaration of rights than a contract of submission to authority. Its purpose was to prevent dissent among passengers, some of whom were not separatists but hired laborers or adventurers. From the very beginning, the Pilgrims Project was not about freedom for all, but about control and cohesion for themselves. If the Pilgrims were a small band of exiles, the Puritans who followed were an organized movement. Beginning in 1630, thousands left England in what historians call the Great Migration. These settlers were wealthier, better educated, and far more numerous. They did not see themselves as separatists, but as reformers, determined to purify the Church of England by creating a model society abroad. At their head was John Winthrop, who would serve as governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. His famous words about a city upon a hill are among the most quoted in American history. Presidents from Kennedy to Reagan have invoked them as symbols of American exceptionalism. But Winthrop's meaning was very different. His sermon, delivered aboard the ship Arbella, was a stern warning, not a celebration. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," he said. "The eyes of all people are upon us." If they failed to obey God, if they broke their covenant, they would become a cautionary tale of divine punishment. The city on a hill was not a beacon of liberty. It was a model of obedience under God's judgment. Massachusetts Bay was built on this covenant. Only church members could vote. Civil authority was tied directly to religious authority. Ministers held immense influence, and the colony's laws enforced moral and religious conformity. This was not a democracy in any modern sense. It was a commonwealth of believers, bound by strict rules and shared faith. For the Puritans, freedom did not mean the right to choose one's religion. It meant the right to live in a community that enforced their religion without interference. Anyone who strayed from this vision was a threat not only to social order, but to divine favor. And the Puritans responded to such threats with remarkable severity. The very words that modern politicians use as a symbol of openness were in their original context a warning of exclusion and punishment. To understand the depth of this paradox, we must look at daily life in Puritan New England. Attendance at church was mandatory. Failure to appear could result in fines or public punishment. Laws regulated behavior from the way people dressed to the way they celebrated or did not celebrate holidays. Christmas, viewed as a corrupt Catholic invention, was banned. Leisure activities like theatre and dancing were discouraged or outlawed. Education was widespread, but its primary purpose was to ensure that every child could read the Bible and internalize religious doctrine. In this society, dissent was not simply disagreement, it was rebellion against God's covenant. Roger Williams, a fiery minister, argued that civil government should not enforce religious practice and that individuals must be free in matters of conscience. For this, he was banished in the dead of winter. He survived only by sheltering with the Narragansett people, later founding Rhode Island, where freedom of conscience was truly practiced. Anne Hutchinson, a woman of intelligence and charisma, held meetings in her home, where she criticized the colony's ministers and insisted that God's grace could not be controlled by human institutions. For this, she was tried for heresy, exiled, and eventually killed in New Netherland. The Quakers faced even worse. Their belief in the inner light and refusal to bow to external authority made them intolerable to the Puritan leaders. Laws were passed to punish them, and 4 Quakers were executed on Boston Common in the 1660s. One of them, Mary Dyer, was hanged for returning to preach after being banished. These stories reveal a grim truth. The colonies founded by those fleeing persecution quickly became places of persecution themselves. Freedom for them was never universal. It was reserved for the faithful, defined on their terms. Yet ironically, their harshness forced the birth of alternatives. Rhode Island, born of exile, became a haven for religious diversity. Later generations would look back at Puritan punishments and see the need for broader liberty. The very attempt to suppress freedom planted seeds for its eventual expansion. No myth is more deeply entrenched than that of Thanksgiving. The Feast of 1621 is remembered as a moment of harmony, when Pilgrims and Wampanoag shared food in gratitude for survival. The truth, however, is more complicated and more tragic. When the Pilgrims arrived, the Wampanoag people had already been devastated by disease brought by earlier European contact. Epidemics swept through the region between 1616 and 1619, killing perhaps 90% of the coastal population. Villages were emptied, survivors traumatized. When the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth, they built their homes on land that had once belonged to the Patuxet, a people wiped out by plague. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, saw the Pilgrims not simply as neighbors, but as potential allies in a shifting balance of power. Surrounded by enemies and weakened by loss, he struck an alliance with the newcomers. The feast we call the First Thanksgiving was not a celebration of eternal friendship, but a pragmatic moment in a fragile alliance. As English numbers grew, this balance collapsed. The Puritans, arriving in greater numbers, pushed into native lands. In 1637, the Pequot War erupted. At Mystic, Puritan soldiers and their native allies surrounded a Pequot village, set it ablaze, and killed hundreds of men, women, and children. John Mason, a Puritan commander, later wrote that the victory was the Lord's doing. To the Pequots, it was massacre. Decades later, King Philip's War broke out as native peoples resisted further expansion. It became one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population. Entire towns were destroyed. Thousands died. The colonists prevailed, but the war left a legacy of devastation and fear. The myth of Thanksgiving hides this reality. It reduces centuries of conflict to a single meal of harmony. It suggests unity where there was conquest. It is not that the feast never happened, it did, but to stop there is to accept a dangerous half-truth. Within the colonies themselves, life was harsh and disciplined. Work was constant. Farming, building, gathering firewood, and preparing for winter left little room for leisure. Joy itself could be suspect. Public amusements were rare, and private indulgence was closely watched. Laws regulated not only behavior, but appearance. Clothing was to be modest and plain. Sumptuary laws restricted luxury. Even children's play was monitored for signs of idleness. Punishments were public and designed to shame. The stocks and pillory displayed offenders for all to see. Whippings were conducted before crowds. Adultery could be punished by branding. Blasphemy could mean execution. The colony was a place where order was valued above comfort and conformity above individuality. Women were confined largely to domestic roles. They could not vote, rarely spoke in public forums, and were expected to submit to male authority. Children were raised with strict discipline, taught to fear sin, and often reminded of their inherent depravity. Yet, in their rigidity, the Puritans also built strengths. Their commitment to literacy created one of the most educated societies in the world at that time. Their emphasis on community and mutual aid allowed them to endure hardships that might have destroyed less disciplined groups. Their town meetings, though limited to church members, set precedents for local self-government. But all of this came at a cost. For those who did not believe, who dissented, or who simply longed for more freedom of expression, life was suffocating. The Puritan dream of liberty looked, to many, more like a cage. So, what legacy did the Pilgrims and Puritans leave? It is a paradox. On one hand, they contributed values that continue to shape American identity: hard work, education, community, and the idea of mission. They sought to build a model society that would inspire the world. On the other hand, they modeled intolerance, persecution, and violence. They restricted liberty to a chosen few and punished all who strayed. They are remembered as founders of freedom, yet they lived as enforcers of conformity. And yet history is full of paradoxes that produce progress. Their persecution of dissenters led directly to experiments in tolerance elsewhere. Rhode Island became a refuge of conscience. Pennsylvania, founded later by Quakers, embraced pluralism. Even the memory of Puritan harshness inspired later generations to demand a broader liberty. Their conflicts with native peoples remind us of the cost of colonization, a cost that cannot be erased by myth. Their words about a city upon a hill, stripped of their original severity, were transformed over centuries into a promise of hope, invoked by presidents as diverse as Kennedy and Reagan. In this transformation, we see how myths are made. The Pilgrims and Puritans were not saints, nor were they demons. They were human beings driven by fear, faith, ambition, and vision. Their story shows us that freedom was not born whole at America's founding. It was contested, narrowed, and expanded across generations. It was won not by those who enforced conformity, but by those who challenged it. So the next time we hear the simple story of the Pilgrims seeking freedom, we should remember the deeper truth. They sought freedom for themselves, but in doing so, they forced America to wrestle with what freedom really means. And perhaps that struggle, ongoing even today, is their truest legacy. So, were the Pilgrims and Puritans champions of liberty or champions of control? The answer is both. And in that contradiction lies the seed of America's identity. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below. I'd love to hear your perspective.